you say that the mistake is both in misreading the evidence, but it's also in thinking that any kind of evidence about group tendencies would override, let me see if I've got you right, the ethical imperative to judge human beings as individuals first and not as members of a group second.
Yes, very much. I mean, now, in terms of whether Darwin believed that there could be racial differences, a lot depends on the adverbs. I mean, he makes it a point in the expression of motion in animals and man that the fact that the facial expressions and bodily postures are the same across races strongly suggests a story of monogenesis as opposed to polygenesis, namely there was a common ancestor of all of Homo sapiens, and that our psychological traits, which were indexed by our facial expressions, must have been in place before the divergence of what we now call races. And he says things like substantially the same, mostly in place. So he left a crack open for there to be some quantitative differences among races. And depending on, I mean, you know his writings more thoroughly than I do, and I think there are probably places where you could say that he believes there may have been some slight differences, but he obviously believes we're one species. And of course he was liberal in the best sense of the term, of being believing in universal human rights. And I think it very much does hinge on that passage that you quoted, which later Peter Singer expanded into a book called The Expanding Circle. The idea that whatever sense of sympathy evolution bequeathed us with is something that will automatically tend to inflate. That is, even if you start off just feeling the pain of your kin and clan, as you get to encounter other peoples, you'll naturally extend it to the tribe, the nation, other races, and very
ultimately
recently,
all mankind.
Darwin didn't live to see the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but he was right that once you set this process in motion, there's no stopping it. And indeed, it's not a coincidence that Peter Singer, who wrote The Expanding Circle, also wrote Animal Liberation, arguing that there's nothing to prevent our circle of sympathy from expanding to other sentient creatures, including other animals. And I think it's not the same idea, but it's related to the idea that the ethical ideal of equality isn't an empirical claim that we're all indistinguishable, because the facts are going to be what the facts are going to be, and Darwin did leave the crack open that there may be small quantitative differences. But it is the principle that that people have to be treated as individuals and not prejudged according to the statistics of arbitrary groups that they belong to. And I think the attitude of the expanding circle of sympathy is a kind of psychological undergirding of this moral principle that it's the sympathy that I expect from myself and my family, I have no choice but to expand to all other individuals. And just as I don't want to be prejudged as a member of some group, I can't apply that prejudice to others.
So that what you're saying then is that the ethical imperative is an ethical imperative, but it's not alien to biology. It's not alien to our psychology in some way. It's not determined by it, but it's not something that we're built to resist.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't be too optimistic about how much of it comes naturally. I think social psychology seems to suggest that by default, that circle of sympathy is much smaller than we would like it to be on ethical grounds, and that it takes literacy, education, cosmopolitanism, all of the forces of liberalism that you discuss in the book that are really a late accomplishment of our civilization to push that circle of empathy outward. Without those liberal attitudes, it's apt to shrink. And so nationalism, tribalism, racism are probably closer to the natural state of our psychological makeup, but fortunately they can be pushed outward.
It seems, though, that in thinking in those terms, then the choice there's a false choice that's given us between escaping from Darwinism, that is to say, we have to overcome the things that Darwin tells us about our natural selves in some way, and believing in some kind of universality. I mean, one of the things that's become clear, just by serendipity in the past years, that simultaneous with my own little book, Desmond and Moore have published their big book, Darwin's Sacred Cause, Desmond and Moore being two of Darwin's most distinguished biographers, which is simply about Darwin and abolitionism, and in which they try to root Darwin's commitment very early on to an evolutionary view into evolution by natural selection from 1838 on, as being inextricably bound to his belief in abolition, that is, to his hatred of slavery, particularly as it was practiced in the United States, as practiced in South America as well. And so that his end was both, in some sense, in a certain way, in a tendentious way, in a way that he had a political agenda, but the political agenda was exactly universalism. That is, that it was about, that it was unthinkable, unimaginable for one race of human beings to enslave another race because they were simply brothers within the same family. And part of that was partly the inheritance of the Darwin and Wedgwood family on both sides. It was the Wedgwoods, his Wedgwood grandfathers, who had made that famous abolitionist plate showing the slave in shackles saying, "Am I not a man and a brother?" And that's so that, in some sense, if there's a political agenda in Darwin's own work, it's radical universalism, not its opposite. But nonetheless, we still see that kind of thinking and that kind of approach to questions of race, questions of intelligence, and so on, as being prevalent. Are you saying, Steve, that you don't believe that those differences exist, or you believe that those kinds of differences should be subsumed in this larger picture of the ever expanding wedge of human sympathy and liberal values?
Well, I would say liberal values should not hinge on the empirical assumption that sexes, races, ethnic groups are biologically indistinguishable. In many cases, they surely are. In some cases, they may not be. I don't believe that men and women are psychologically indistinguishable in every respect. But I don't believe that any policy of how we ought to treat men and women or blacks and whites should depend on the empirical claim that they are or aren't identical. We certainly know that anything you want to measure in any human groups, the overlap is enormous, if not complete. And that gives a practical justification for treating individuals as individuals. Namely, you don't really buy very much if you use as prior information what group they belong to.
In the sense you mean, Steve, that in other words, that even if it were to be true, no necessary evidence that it is, that men were better than women at math, you would still have such a huge class of women who were superb at math, far better than I could ever be at math, that you could staff every department in the country exclusively with women if you made that as a social decision.
That's right, that if you were to try to short-circuit the selection process by saying, let's give a few extra points to this sex or that sex because of the statistics, you would gain so little that you'd be much better off looking at the individual. I mean, in either direction, because you can make the same argument for staffing, say, English departments with women based on the greater measured verbal fluency of women. So there is the statistical argument, but there's also the moral argument that it's unfair to the individual. And so if you have a policy of fairness, then it really is a policy of the rights of the individual, because you don't want to make it vulnerable to an empirical claim that might be overturned tomorrow. I mean, for all we know, it could be that women on average are biologically better than men at verbal skills, or men at better than women at spatial skills statistically. And you don't want to be in a position of saying, okay, let's go back to gender discrimination. It wasn't so bad after all. We were wrong. You want to say, well, we were right in treating individuals as individuals. And then as a scientific question, you can ask what's the overlap of the distributions and what are the sources of whatever differences there may be. But you don't compromise this important principle of equality.
You don't want your values to be exploded by a paper in Nature tomorrow.
That's right. At least certainly not those values.
Not those, right? Not,
yeah.